Greetings and welcome to the podcast channel of the Major Contemporary Strategic Issues Chair. The theme for 2024 is Confrontations and Strategic Recompositions. This episode is an extract from a lecture given by John Bew, Professor of History and Foreign Policy, King's College, London. The conference is entitled British Strategy in a Changing World, Past, Present and Future. Don't hesitate to subscribe to our podcast or YouTube channel to keep up to date with all our publications. We hope you enjoy listening.
Good evening, Louis. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be here at Sorbonne University tonight.
Forgive me, I will speak in English this evening, and please forgive me even more because I will speak in English with an Irish accent. So I hope not to speak too quickly, but I am born and bred in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and much as I've spent half of my life in England, it's still, the residue is still there, and there's certain words you may pick up on that sound strange for the translator. As you heard from Louis, I am very much an academic, first and foremost, a trained historian who, perhaps to a certain extent against my wishes, found myself in government service 5 years ago, and it's a real pleasure to speak at such a distinguished academic setting. And I want to speak as a historian and as an academic who's been involved in policy making rather than primarily a policymaker. And today I want to do something which is offer you a grand sweep of British grand strategy and national security. I will try and cover as many centuries as possible in the space of certainly under an hour, and preferably something more like 45 minutes. So forgive the brevity and the simplicity with which I will deal with some periods of history. Some periods of history, of course, that involve happy Anglo-French relations, and some periods of history that involve less happy Anglo-French relations. And I want to take that story right up to the modern period, and I imagine with journalists and people very much consumed about current national security, we can bring the discussion to a more present-minded state. But I'm going to start with history, and I'm going to lean in hard on history because I think history, and this is the main argument of my lecture today, history, historic knowledge, historic sensibility, the type of reasoning that comes through knowing and understanding history is absolutely vital to help us navigate what is a very difficult national security, international policy environment. I think history must come first. So today's lecture comes in 3 parts. In the first, I will talk about, with great brevity and pace and brio, I hope, the foundations of British grand strategy. Then I'm going to talk about some of the key foreign policy traditions and dilemmas that emerge because of the unique circumstances of British history. And by the way, I'm a believer in Henry Kissinger's dictum, and also perhaps Montesquieu's dictum, that nations have characters and that those characters are shaped by historical circumstance. And I think that is very important for today. And then I'm going to take this story in the last part of my remarks right up to the present day and talk about how the UK does and thinks about national security today. But I think history is the clue to that. First of all, what is grand strategy, this term I'm using? Grand strategy simply for me, and there's much contest in this in the academy at the moment, means big picture and long-term thinking. Big picture and long-term thinking. It's not a managerial approach to security. You have grand strategic moments in history when you must think about your first-order assumptions and the big picture and the long term. So the core emphasis of grand strategy is to secure the long-term security, peace and prosperity of a nation or a group of nation, and it belies these modern intellectual distinctions between things like soft and hard power, and also between the material and the spiritual resources of nations or a set of different nations. And crucially, and I have revealed my hand by now, it stresses the role of history and lessons from history and how to apply historic knowledge. Although I'm going to caveat that at the end with some quotes from the great French thinker, writer, advisor, Regis Debray. Grand strategy, as we understand it, is an English language term which was first used in the late 19th century, but really crystallized in the interwar period, particularly the 1930s, through the thinker and writer Basil Littlehart. And he called grand strategy higher strategy. So it's something about going beyond military strategy to dig deep at the time of planning, mobilization, and the search for resources and preparation for war in the 1930s. He went on to say that grand strategy should both calculate and develop the economic resources and manpower of nations, so if you like, their material resources, but also the moral resources of a nation or a group of nation to foster the people's willing spirit, as is often to possess more concrete forms of power. And that was simply because in the 1930s and the early 1940s, the British experience of world wars was not a pleasant one. Those returning from 1918 felt the promises had been broken to them, and the prospect of fighting a war for empires or for what they saw as corrupt elites was not a particularly popular one. And actually much of the modern British state is born of the Second World War, including things like the National Health Service, which is a wartime measure. Crucially, grand strategy also looked to the peace that came after the war. And what emerges in the context, particularly with Foreign Office planners in conjunction with allies and partners, is a concept of a grand strategy for peace that is designed above all to learn the lessons of the failures of the previous half century. And that emerges after 1945. A grand strategy of peace that's reflected in the United Nations, which of course is a great power piece first and foremost. A grand strategy of peace that's reflected in the building of collective security, because it's the failure of collective security in the 1920s and the 1930s that leads, in the minds of British strategists, to the Second World War. Now, modern definitions of grand strategy are de rigueur again, partly, and this probably dates to about 10 years ago, the publication of Henry Kissinger's book on world order in 2014, which spoke of a crisis of international order in which the foundation stones, the balance of power, was being disrupted by changes to that. And that's seen a revival of interest in grand strategy, a move away from a counterterrorism heavy focus in our national security apparatus, a move away from a management of risk, and appreciation that great power dynamics, great power politics are back in play in a serious way. I think the best book on grand strategy is the one produced by the American scholar Hal Brands, who asks the question, what good is grand strategy? And describes it, in a light touch way that it's most useful for us to say. So grand strategy today, I don't think, should be mistaken as an idea of a perfect alignment of ends, ways, means, resources equals goals equals ends. It is about that big picture thinking. It is about that intellectual architecture. And grand strategic moments come when the fundamental assumptions on which leaders or states have operated and thought about the world get shaken by events. I think we are in a grand strategic moment right now, which calls on the need for grand strategic thinking. And what Brands describes grand strategic thinking as a necessity for a purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what a nation seeks to accomplish in the world. Easier said than done, but not overinterpreted and not overasserted. First of all, and this is not a plea for global Britain or the importance of Britain, I will be humble before you this evening in the manner of Franco-British relations. But this is a plea of why the story of British grand strategy matters, and I'll make a couple of observations why I think it matters. First of all, because the scale of Britain's influence in the world, certainly from the late 19th through to the early portion of the 20th century, is by any reasonable metric significant. That applies both to the expansion of the British Empire, but also to its unravelling and collapse in many places in the world. And you can see trouble spots in areas where I think probably the French and the British uniquely have left some messes around the globe, which are part of our national security challenges today. The role of British grand strategy is therefore vital to understanding European security, concepts like collective security, concepts like the balance of power. It's also vital because it's understood and was shaped by competition with other grand strategies, Napoleonic grand strategy, Wilhelmite grand strategy as well, and that contest I will say a little about in a moment as well. And as I said, it has these global implications and hugely difficult legacies. The next reason why the story of grand strategy is important is it has a really significant role on America's awakening in the 20th century to superpower consciousness. The first set of ideas and precedents used by American grand strategic thinkers come from the British example. Now, there's an important caveat to that, which is the American superpowerdom of the 20th century is built consciously or self-consciously on an anti-British imperial model. It is defining itself as not being the British Empire, from which, of course, American independence was achieved. And yet it adopts many similar habits in terms of actions, behaviours, commercial reach, military projection of force and power thereafter. And if you read Henry Kissinger, if you read George Kennan, if you read the memoirs of anyone from JFK to Roosevelt to Nixon, you will see the British example and the British presidents and the British stories very much infecting the American strategic mind, for good or worse. The two groups of individuals we can see on the slide behind us, one is Uncle Sam, the well-known figure of American power in the 20th century. The other is John Bew, who's the cartoon figure of Britain and Britain abroad, a beer-drinking, roast beef, you might call him, not one for continental manners, robust around the waist, simple speaking, assertive. That's the sort of British self-image of the 19th and 20th century. And it's a relationship that's fascinating in grand strategic terms because it starts with contest, rivalry and suspicion, and it ends up in an unlikely and not entirely predictable proximity of an Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American world, really, that peaks in this period of the Atlantic Charter in 40 and 41. That story is significant for the American rise to power. Now, I will not take you all the way back to 1485, but I'll offer you 3 or 4 pillars, historic pillars, to understand this British strategic story and Britain's entry in the world. And for the first few centuries, I must confess, it's a story that's projected against the fear of and the admiration and the suspicion of French power in Europe. Spanish power initial, but also French power in Europe. There's an excellent book, one of many, by David Scott, which looks at the emergence of British foreign policy and Britain's projection in Europe over this period. And in it, he says, much indeed like America's projection of power in the 19th and 20th century, there's a schizophrenia to Britain's actions abroad. On the one hand, there is a fear of involvement and entanglement with Europe, Catholic Europe, tyrannical Europe, in the British Protestant mindset. On the other hand, there's a desire to acquire property, to acquire commerce, an assertion of maritime power that brings you into that world. And there's another schizophrenia. There's a fear of, there's what you might call negative impulses, a fear of foreigners, greed, xenophobia, and then there's more of what you might call positive characteristics that come along with this, like a very lively public sphere, a strong tradition of newspapers and challenges to government, and an ethical, what Scott calls a tendency to moral panic about international affairs, like the fate of this minority, that minority, that forces Britain out abroad. All nations are schizophrenic. It's not quite what Montesquieu said, but I think that's what he was getting at in his remarks. Now, again, to zip through that period of time, I would refer to another excellent book by my former doctoral supervisor, Brendan Sims in Cambridge, who talks about the rise and fall of the First British Empire. Crucial thing to understand about British statecraft is that the process of British state formation was a very difficult one, with the Acts of Union between England and Scotland, and then the Acts of Union between England and Ireland, the latter more tumultuous and difficult. So you have a period of state formation, religious and ethnic tension within the British Isles. But Britain, by 1715, after the Anglo-Scottish Union, can be deemed a kind of middle-ranking European power by that period. And then over the course of the 19th century begins to involve itself, not simply by the creation of a blue water strategy, says Brendan Sims, but also, crucially, and you can see why this book was very interesting in the period up to the Brexit referendum of 2016, also by an activist continental policy. And crucially, that is given formed by a royal connection with the House of Hanover in Germany, which gives Britain a landing spot, if you like, in European affairs. So the Europeanness and the maritime element are two things that are balanced throughout. And then you have the birth, or if you like, the professionalisation of British foreign policy, which comes after the fall of the First British Empire. It comes after the loss of America, which is a huge political shock in British politics, primarily a shock because many of those in British politics and the British Parliament sympathise with the cause and the principles of the American revolutionists. So it leads to an internal angst and soul-searching, seen in Edward Gibbon's book about the rise and fall of the British Empire. It says we've got to fix ourselves internally before we were able to look again at our empire and the world outside. And so that leads to the introduction of meritocracy in the army. It leads to parliamentary reform, getting at old corruption. And it leads to the creation of the British Foreign Office in the 1780s and the 1790s. So there's a professionalisation of Britain really from this period of time. And zipping through history very fast, lo and behold, comes another grand strategic challenge that crashes on the heads of British policymakers in a way that causes a huge psychological and structural impact in the British state. And that is how to deal with first revolutionary and secondarily Napoleonic France. And the key thing to, at the risk of being reductive or essentializing this process, the key challenge posed by revolutionary France is the concept of wars fought as part of a nation, as opposed to wars fought for simple raison d'etat by dynasties in Europe. So a nation is mobilized through levée en masse, which provides strategic and political and ideological challenges that Britain has not seen before. So you get a further expansion of the British state. Income tax, the most hated tax in British politics, is actually a wartime measure introduced in response to the challenge from revolutionary and Napoleonic France in 1793. The British state increases sixfold in the 1790s to meet this threat. The British Army grows to its biggest size ever in this period of time, its biggest size ever in history thereafter. So the British state is transformed by the challenge from France, and thus begins a cartoon you may recognise of William Pitt the Younger and Napoleon carving up different parts of the world. Britain taking much of the globe of the empire, Napoleon taking Europe thereafter. It takes Britain 6 coalitions to come to terms with Napoleonic France, but it's the only country on each side of the coalition against France over that period of time. So it's a huge period for diplomacy and struggle. And you can see why Napoleonic France is a grand strategic challenge to Britain. All its nightmares coming at once. The fear of invasion, the fear of being cut off from trade, the fear of the House of Hanover being isolated, the fear of the navigation of the River Scheldt being blocked. And there's huge invasion fears in Britain over this period of time as well. So this is a strategic nightmare for Britain in 1812. And thus begins sort of modern British grand strategy from this period of time. And the concept of the balance of power, which had floated around in political theory and political thought, becomes nested in the goal of the government as stated in that period of time. No one power can be allowed to become dominant on the European continent. The Low Countries must survive and be protected. Their independence must be protected by whatever means. The Scheldt River must have freedom of navigation. Britain must be able to trade with Europe. Britain must avoid this fear that a French or an enemy fleet could attack the homeland within 24 or 48 hours from a sheltered port, say, from Copenhagen. Britain actually firebombs Copenhagen in 1806, kills 3,000 people, just for fear that the French fleet may build a fleet from that moment of time as well. And then crucially also Britain begins to develop these landing spots in the Mediterranean Sea. And the first grand strategic document, I think, in British history, a very rare document, is taken by Lord Castlereagh, the great European British Foreign Secretary, on New Year's Day, 1814, to the continent in the last phases of the Napoleonic Wars, agreed by cabinet, and says you can negotiate anything you want in Europe, but it must answer these principal concerns. There must be no discussion of maritime rights. That is the area where Britain has a strategic advantage from everyone else. So if the victorious powers are to meet, if Napoleon is to be defeated, maritime is off the table. That's Britain's domain. There can be no arbitration, and the Russians are very kindly offering, of Britain's dispute with America. Britain fears arbitration by others. Strong powers fear arbitration by others. France must leave the Low Countries, which were going to be solidified and protected. The French fleet at Antwerp must be destroyed. Colonies can be given back to France, and there's a big noise domestically among producers, among merchants, that Britain hands back over its colonies. France can go back to the 1793 borders, but also, crucially, France must be allowed to rejoin the community of nations immediately. Why? Because the balance of power matters more by 1815 than any ideological fight between Britain and France. And almost immediately, the light bulb switches in the heads of British grand strategists, and they get very concerned that the second fear that comes after 1945 too, is that, and the basis of Western Europe being weakened and destroyed, that Russia, Tsarist Russia, will bear over Europe and upset the balance of power again. You have a particularly hyperactive, ideological, in some cases well-meaning Tsar as well in this period of time. And almost immediately, Britain goes so far as to threaten a defensive war against Russia because it's asserting itself over Poland in this period of time. Napoleon, by the way, says of Lord Castlereagh, Britain's realist foreign secretary, "I don't understand how such a great nation could be governed by such a fool in this period of time." I think more fondly of Castlereagh as his biographer. So British foreign policy after 1815 is to try and do the European foreign policy that it wants to conduct in the course of the 18th century, to keep working within the Congress system, to keep a hyperactive Russian Tsar grouped. It's the phrase that Castlereagh uses, to take the edges off his behaviour, to keep him in the tent. But it immediately becomes unpopular because of the moral panic of British politics. Britain is seen as too close to Europe on left and right, actually primarily on left, too close to monarchical Europe, too close to anti-democratic Europe, too willing to do the bidding of emperors and kings with whom Britain shares little in ideological terms in common. So poor old Lord Castlereagh, by 1820, has to sign his own divorce papers from Europe in Britain's State Paper of 1820. And the reason why is because the Congress and the Holy Alliance want to assert monarchical government over stateless principalities that are struggling for freedom. And Britain politically cannot broach that. It cannot use collective intervention to put down democracy, democratic movements, or liberal movements. And so Castlereagh declares that breakaway from Europe in 1820. I wouldn't describe this as sort of original sin or anything otherwise, and I'll be very brief about what happens thereafter. But over the course of the 19th century, from that basis, you have Britain distancing itself from Europe, developing these caricatures, the Russian octopus, the Ottoman Sultan knocked sideways to the floor. I'll keep my caricatures to the east, I suppose, so I don't have to go over to the west. But the distancing from Europe over the 19th century has huge strategic consequence, and also the expansion of the empire that happens. Interestingly, in 1870, a parliamentary committee agrees that Britain should not expand its empire anymore because it's causing a problem, that it's growing so far hard and fast, and it's causing an economic problem and a military problem to try and protect it. But the empire grows and grows and grows and grows thereafter, and it grows partly in competition with other European and international empires thereafter. So the grand strategic game kicks in really from the 1870s. And this is the moment, interestingly, when the term grand strategy first emerges. There's a confluence of strategic challenges, many of which I think look very pertinent for today. The collapse or decline of both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, so the weakness of other empires, French ambitions in the Suez Canal, of course, which would have a long and checkered history through to the mid-part of the 20th century. Above all, the rising power of Germany, which appears more militaristic, but also potentially more modern, efficient and effective. Imperial rivalries that emerge thereafter when every European country wants its so-called place in the sun. And also international rivalries that go beyond that in the form of America and latterly Japan as well. There's a famous book that which argues the British Empire was created in a fit of absent mind Now, a very controversial book, one can imagine, the idea that it was created in a fit of absent mind, but it was created without a grand strategy to protect it. And that's what British grand strategists begin to struggle with in the late 19th century. Other powers that grow faster, that are stronger, that are growing iron ships, blood and iron in terms of Bismarck. America, they're using tariffs, how offensive, versus the British free trading model, that are more authoritarian and militaristic, that are seeking empires, all of which conflated also with the notion of social Darwinism again. And what really transpires, and this is the 20th century story, is that this huge empire, which is at its peak in 1920, becomes a strategic curse as well as a blessing. It gives you great attributes. It gives you great resource. It's crucial to the First and Second World War in terms of manpower and the imperial armies. Absolutely vital, but it is increasingly hard to defend against different challenges and different threats geopolitically. So it's a strategic disaster almost as much as it is a strategic asset thereafter. And into the 20th century then, I'll be very brief, we're half an hour in, so I'm still in good time. You have a different mode of British foreign policy, and I'll come back to this in a moment in my final remarks as well. But an end of splendid isolation, a return to engagement with Europe in those fateful years, in the 14 years before the First World War, and a desire, crucially, to find new allies and partners to reflect and begin to prepare for the coming storm that people can perceive. Two crucial elements of that: the Entente Cordiale, first time in centuries that Britain and France put down their enmities, resolved a number of disputes, but an Entente Cordiale, by the way, that stops at being a diplomatic alliance. It is not a military alliance, crucially, question on that. Also the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the first European-Asian alliance over this period of time, which is a defensive alliance as well. So a period of hyperactive British diplomacy in the first 10 years of the 20th century. And I think that is the most pertinent lesson for us today, but I will come back to it. Again, the grand strategic document, probably the most important of the 20th century, is the famous Eyre-Crowe Memorandum from 1907 that says the Entente Cordiale is not enough. And it's the Eyre-Crowe Memorandum that says the enemy of Britain is going to be Germany, and we are set on a path towards war over this period of time. Hugely influential book, a memo by a relatively low-level official. For those of you who work in government, even if you're a low-level official, sometimes your memos can get a significant pickup. In Neil Ferguson's book, The Pity of War, he says actually some of Eyre-Crowe's ideas lead to this sleepwalk or this slide into war that becomes a huge problem, and there were other ways forward. But in that memorandum, he describes British grand strategy in the most vivid terms. And what he says essentially is because of the diffuse nature of British power, and because it spread everywhere else, and because it is a commercial free trading nation, it is in the strategic interests of Britain to harmonise with the interests of mankind. And that simply means it is in the strategic interest of Britain to stand for those who are seeking to detach themselves or defend themselves from autocracy or the assertion of power. It's kind of an early 20th century version of democratic peace theory for those of you in the academy. But in that, he says, Britain must inevitably be driven to oppose any country threatening this equilibrium. The world works for Britain, and therefore someone challenging it needs to be challenged and not back down. Very redolent of American grand strategy. So zipping through from that period of time, from much of the period after 1918, and this is very much with the case after 1945, you have infused into British foreign policy and grand strategy something even more aspirational. So an empire that is diffuse and weak and challenged, what do we need to do? We need to build a world system or a world order in which it is protected, preserved, and there is an equilibrium restored. That is the mission of British foreign policy, really, from the 1918 onwards thereafter. It's in famous books by H.G. Wells. It has a scientific science fiction component to it, and crucially, it's a project which Britain manages to convince America to get on board with over the course. Not easily, however. The first chance to do this is through the League of Nations, establishing collective security, establishing arbitration between nations, a community of nations to come together to work through international problems. But only Britain and France ultimately try and fail and make it work over this period of time. A famous quote from the British realist historian E.H. Carr, who says, "America is offered the leadership of the world in 1919 and turns it down." But when the international order collapses in the 30s, that focus on ending anarchy and violence through ordering, whether you have a more realist order, a balance of power, or a more idealistic order of free nations coming together, remains in the DNA of British foreign policy. Churchill says in 1943, it must be world order or anarchy, and that's picked up by influential figures both pre- and post-war, from Roosevelt through to JFK thereafter. What happens in this international order after 1945 is that it creates the thing that the pre-1945 international order didn't have. It enforces not only the multilateral system, but it has collective security at its foundation, and collective security with America behind it. That's the difference after 1945. So thereafter, British foreign policy is very easy, for the sake of this lecture, or perhaps not so easy. But it is set in very clear foundations thereafter. It is based not on splendid isolation, but on the tightest possible alliances with the United States and through Europe. There's a renewed emphasis on planning and preemption of threats, and that's seen initially in the Korean War thereafter. There is a very difficult, painful, chaotic move from an empire to a commonwealth, which has a strategic logic to it, but is much less strategic as it plays out. And then there's a shift in the early Cold War to old ideas of balance of power, spheres of influence. The Americans can't quite believe how imperial the British are in the first 2 years of the Cold War. And in fact, a lot of Americans blame British hawkishness over North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. Old imperial habits as being part of this as well. We know that the British Empire is unsustainable. I won't go through that story, but I will hit this keynote, often quoted concept from a quote from Dean Acheson, US Secretary of State, in December 1962, who says that Britain has lost an empire, has not yet found a role. A quote that's wheeled out every 2 or 3 years in British discourse thereafter. But there's a basic grand strategy that goes from Churchill through to Blair and thereafter, which is to have, as Churchill described it, the closest possible relationship with Europe. Easier said than done. One of the most fun historic debates is what would Churchill have thought about the Brexit debate? There's a case he was for. There's a case that he'd be against leaving the European Union. Both advocates, by the way, are fully confident in their position. We will soon be able to find out, because of artificial intelligence, we'll be able to speak to Churchill, who will be like an AI hologram, and tell us in a number of years. But that core idea of closeness to Europe, a special relationship with the United States, and in a Commonwealth as well as the sort of three strategic pillars. So Blair described this as the Atlantic Bridge, but countless times over the period of the War on Terror, there was headlines on the front page of the London Times, London's bridge is falling down over this period of time. So very difficult balancing act over this period of time, which takes us in my remaining last 5 to 10 minutes or so to British national security today, where I think hopefully most of our discussion will focus over. There's one of our 2 aircraft carriers. I believe you guys have an aircraft carrier too. So the strategic dilemmas in the post-Brexit period are well known and still being worked through, and I've been intimately involved in some of the discussions around those. Does the UK have a certain selfish strategic interest in a certain type of international order? Undoubtedly it does. And what sort of grand strategy would serve this? What are the military and diplomatic establishments that Britain needs to maintain to serve these ends? In 2010, you had, in response to the financial crisis, a period of austerity, and that was reflected in both defence and the size of the diplomatic establishment. There's been a quite significant increase thereafter. Is it time for a new definition of the national interest that Britain is now out of the European Union? Less a security concern, but it does have security implications. It requires, or there's an expectation on Britain to be more active in new markets in places like the Indo-Pacific as well. None of these things are easy. What about this period of 20 years in which humanitarian intervention particularly in the Middle East, was a major feature of British foreign policy. What does that mean? There's strong echoes of the French debate about this as well. And above all, how does Britain adapt not only to revanchist Russia, but to the rise of new powers, those that look more benign and those that look less benign, for example, with China, India and China, respectively. So in the 2021 National Security Strategy, which I was intimately involved in, we had a sort of 4-part assessment of that context in which we operated. And that was one which chimes, I think, a lot with other partners and allies' assessments of the international situation. So I think one of the things you have seen across the West and its allies, not simply in the West, but in places like the Indo-Pacific, is a convergence of analysis and a convergence of assessment of the threat and challenge. And we identified sort of 4 large trends and shifts which we thought were shaping the international order. The first was geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts by simple metrics of power, a shift increasingly from the Euro-Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific and other theaters, just in terms of pure metrics of economic and military power, but also oddities within that, within the G20, so the rising importance of countries, for example, like Saudi Arabia, in terms of their heft, reach, military and other investments. Systemic competition, and we use this phrase carefully because we didn't use the US phrase great power competition. And we say systemic competition, we mean competition between systems of government, economic systems, technological systems as well, which has a strong geopolitical component to it, which we could perhaps speak about more. The next challenge is rapid technological change. The UK and France have both done a lot of work, for example, on AI safety, AI regulation. That is the picture, that's the part of the picture that moves most fast for national security makers. And also, crucially, transnational challenges. Now, that is also something in the US national security strategy, the Biden national security strategy. Transnational challenges, climate change, migration, transnational crime. Again, and that's linked to the technology as well. Essentially, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, and therefore the challenge is to have resource between each of them. Now, we've lived in a period in which the geopolitical element of that seems so sharp. We must question ourselves whether we retain sufficient focus on the transnational element of it as well. But that's our assessment of the context. And that led to the first of 2 national security strategies, which I've been intimately involved in. The first in March 2021. I think of the context again. This is the month, I think, the end of the TCA negotiations between Britain and the European Union. So not an easy period in terms of being able to define a future relationship for Europe. It led to a big increase in defence spending, the biggest since the end of the Cold War, the merger of our development and diplomatic departments. It's the first attempt to sort of assert a post-Brexit foreign policy. And interestingly, it's in the year of the G7 in Carbis Bay, and it's in the year of the UK hosting of COP22. So it's felt a sort of very active period in British foreign policy. That strategy is based in some respects on sort of standard foundations, core soft power elements, which Britain self-confidently uses these soft power rankings and index. I still think it's very hard to measure soft power as a metric. But we are apparently in whatever source we use, ranked 3rd for soft power. Defence and security, UK's placed within NATO primarily, and then with this expanding defence budget. But again, there's a huge debate in Britain today in all the national newspapers about whether that quantum for defence is enough, and I think that's a debate in France as well. But the 2 new things in the document, or the most important new thing, was for the first time to put science and technology and strategic advantage in science and technology as a core national security aim. And in fact, not only is a core national security aim, it's the first national security aim in the document. And that was quite a big shift, an important signal to those in Whitehall, to those in government, about relative priorities, both for defensive reasons, but also for reasons of economic opportunity as well. And out of that, you get a strategic framework based on 4 pillars, which is an attempt to have a grand strategy for Britain in the 2020s. The first goal of British national security strategy is to sustain strategic advantage through science and technology. The second goal of British national security strategy is to shape the international order. And this is a shift from traditionally, after the end of the Cold War, defending risks or threats to the liberal international order, the rules-based order. Now this is a much more proactive stance to shape that order, particularly where new rules and regulations are being written on things like telecommunications, on things like AI safety, on things like space and cyber. So to shape and have a more shaping role. And shaping is supposed to be a more humble term. Humility is not something that Britain is often accused of in foreign policy. The next fundamental pillar was strengthening security and defence at home and overseas. And again, in black and white, because there's much talk about Britain's Indo-Pacific tilt, in black and white, that document says that NATO and Euro-Atlantic security will remain by far the most the important focus for British national security and defence and investment. That is there in black and white. It's sometimes forgotten about in the debate that happens thereafter. And then finally, this concept of resilience, of which I know there's a lot of interest in France as well. Building resilience at home and overseas is the next foundation stone. So let me zip through a couple of those and bring this to a conclusion. In 2023, we added to this an additional refresh of our national security strategy, which is perhaps a sign of my own failures in 2021, or perhaps more generously a sign of the fact that the international order had a series of new geopolitical challenges that were causing us grave concern. And there's a lot of political interest. So we have in 2023 a refresh under a new prime minister, which is more prudent, I guess, and humble in tone, but reflects the fact that the international situation or the four trends that we identified are accentuating to cause greater concern or greater risk in our national security. And interestingly, within that, there's an increase in defence budget focused on our nuclear enterprise and focused on stockpiles, because there's a defence industrial problem in Europe, which we may discuss over the course of our discussions. It has a commitment to reach 2.5% GDP on defence, although there was no date fixed on that, which is the subject of live political debate on that. And then we have more China-facing capabilities. There's a turn again to recognise the challenge posed by China, particularly in areas like economic security. I'll end on this slide and two observations. It has been an activist period in British foreign policy since 2019, and I won't go through each of those periods of example. It was often said when I first went into government in 2019, why can't we be more like the French? Activist, assertive on our interests. And actually, if I was to characterise British foreign policy over a period of time, I would suggest we have been a bit like the French on a number of national security challenges. So it's been an activist period. A second thing that's happened, and this really is striking and important for the United Kingdom, is that there is a strong degree of bipartisan political consensus around most of these foreign policy manoeuvres and positions. I can't stress that enough. That changes the nature of a country's grand strategy, where it's not deeply politically divided at home over this as well. And perhaps we can talk about the war in Ukraine and some of these issues. But I want to finish with two suggestions based on that historical experience that may help add to this discussion, but also may help guide our collective foreign policy and national security efforts in the years to come. The first is that in these grand strategic moments, we've got to take note of the importance of planning. Liberal, democratic, capitalist economies struggle with planning. They struggle with planning. But the lesson of certainly the interwar years, certainly the period of the middle part of the century, is that planning and finding a way to plan against and in competition with adversaries or those who don't share your values, who plan is a crucial element of an effective grand strategy. That's quite a hard thing for us to do. I think we are at the bottom of the foothills, but we recognise we must make that journey. I think that reckoning, I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago for President Macron's summit. I think that reckoning is shared and that understanding is shared across Europe. Planning and grand strategy is back, and I think it's important that it's back We cannot live in an era where we're just managing risk. We are in a competition. The second is a point on alliances and partnerships. One of the things I think that has been a qualitative difference in this period of time is that Britain has not only asserted the importance of alliances and partnerships. Some alliances and partnerships have been difficult, and I will not say anything more than that, but you will recognise that some relationships have been difficult. Some relationships have been white hot in terms of their depth, in terms of their involvement. And what I think is happening in international affairs across Europe is that a shift to a deeper qualitative shift in the depth of alliances and partnerships that involve technology, that involve trade, that involve shared defence industrial development. If you take the Anglo-French relationship, it could involve things like nuclear as well. So there's a qualitative shift in the quality of alliances. So I'll end with a thought that, number one, planning grand strategy, hard as it is for democracies to do, is absolutely vital. And second, if we were to make a very good use of this period, this decade ahead, compare it to 1904 to 1914, there's a version in which we try and scramble for allies and partners against coming challenges and in fear of war and get it wrong. There is a more optimistic version that if we effectively reimagine, rethink the way that we pool resource when we have less share of global resource, the way that we co-create in areas of strategic competition. If we do that effectively, we might be able to celebrate something as we are this year on 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale, a success for statecraft and a success for security, something that avoids some of the more depressing and bleak predictions that we're sliding into war. Merci beaucoup.